What's up, guys? This is Kaz with Elevateyourcraft, and welcome to episode number 25 of the podcast. And today's topic is progression concepts around hanging leg raise variations. In my previous podcast, where I discussed midsection holds, I mentioned that they were a key factor in renewing my passion for core work, but that was only half of it. Hanging leg raise variations are the other half of what made me truly enjoy core work and get the results that I wanted. And this is why I thought I would dedicate an entire episode of the podcast to them. I also wanted to delve into some insight that acts as a companion to some of the posts I've made demonstrating different core exercises like the hanging knee raise or hanging straight leg raise. And the topics that I'll focus on are proper hanging, momentum, transitional techniques, and I'll finish off with some tips for success. The journey from hanging knee raises to solid rollovers, which is considered the apex of hanging leg raise variations, was a long one because there are many muscle groups that need proper conditioning. For example, hanging alone requires baseline strength in the shoulders, grip, and back, and also activates the muscles around the rib cage. Furthermore, raising the knees, or legs, requires not only strength in the aforementioned areas, but in the hips and core, which include the hip flexors, rectus abdominis, and lower back, to name a few. And progressing toward variations like the pike lift and solid rollovers requires tremendous strength and synergy, and a degree of skill that is developed through diligent practice of the fundamentals and maximizing progression throughout the chain. Not only that, there are always areas of improvement and minor tweaks that one can make within each variation, which is sure to keep you busy for a long time. Keep in mind, these variations are by no means a starting point for beginners. These techniques are useful for those that want to take their core training to the next level and that have a baseline in the fundamentals like push-ups, pull-ups, and core exercises like knee tucks, planks, lying bent, and straight leg raises, and the different midsection holds that I discussed in episode number 23 of the podcast. Lying leg raise variations are particularly useful because they are great precursors to hanging variations. They simulate the leg raise portion without the added difficulty of core stabilization or back, shoulder, and grip strength. And the first area I want to touch on is hanging. There's much more to it than one would think, and it's a very important part of the overall exercise. In fact, bar hangs are considered an exercise in their own right, and anyone using a bar should add it to their repertoire no matter the skill level. It's important to have a firm, strong grip on the bar, whether in overhand, underhand, or neutral grip. And furthermore, the scapula should be retracted and the chest up. You don't want the shoulders to sag. And this additional contraction will allow you to get the most out of each rep and help recruit the necessary muscle groups to their full potential. I'll usually do 2 to 3 sets of bar hangs before I get into leg raise or pull-up work. It's a solid warm-up for the shoulders and grip. And as your strength and skill develop, you can also use earlier progressions in the chain to warm up. Understanding proper technique while hanging is something that I wish I knew right from the start. Getting in the ready position with the scapula retracted is a habit that I picked up later in training, and I only realized it because it was one of the reasons I was developing asymmetrically, and I quickly wanted to understand why. I found that my right side was stronger because it was picking up a bit more of the slack as I progressed through the chain. And once I consistently applied the ready position to my training, it helped me to contract both sides evenly and further appreciate how the muscle groups work together as a chain. Among all the exercises in the leg raise chain, you might notice that momentum is being generated as you go through the concentric and eccentric phases of the movement. This is normally because proper technique cannot be maintained in a slow and controlled way due to a lack of knowledge, strength, or both. And one thing that I have stressed throughout my podcast is not to sacrifice technique for reps. You want to lose little to no momentum whatsoever when performing each variation. This was most challenging for me when I began training hanging knee raises. I found that I would begin swinging slightly, then use effort to stop, all the while prolonging the length I was hanging and bringing about fatigue quicker. One tip that really helped me is extending the legs at a slight angle in front at the bottom of the movement, which will help counteract swinging. As you develop strength and proprioception, you'll learn to maintain control throughout the movement and avoid generating momentum. Al Cavadlo released an article on the PCC blog that I encourage you to check out that discussed the hidden difficulty inherent in the hanging leg raise. In the PCC certification, the final test is called the Century Test, which involves doing 40 bodyweight squats, 30 push-ups, 20 hanging knee raises, and 10 pull-ups in under 8 minutes. And he talks about how oftentimes the hanging leg raise ends up being a lot more difficult than people anticipate, likely due to a lack of preparation. And this in turn means many candidates end up getting no reps, which means your rep doesn't count due to poor technique. One of the main factors to watch out for, he says, is excessive swinging. And this is why I like to put so much emphasis on technique and maintaining control throughout the entire movement. Developing solid habits at the hanging knee raise will pay huge dividends down the line because as your training develops, you'll learn to minimize the use of momentum throughout. You can find the article and many more, of course, on the PCC blog at pccblog.dragondoor.com. One thing I want to bring up again that I talked about in episode 23 on midsection holds is flexibility. And this also applies to hanging leg raise variations. And having the necessary mobility to complement the movements is key in being able to execute them to their fullest potential. Because of this, I encourage you to supplement your training with some stretches to ensure you're staying limber. And some key areas are the hamstrings and hip flexors. And I discussed this in a bit more detail in episode number 23, so be sure to check it out. One area that will give you an indication of mobility limitations is in attempting the pike lift. And one of the ways to make a pike lift, for example, more difficult is to reduce the amount you're leaning back during the movement. But this might prove difficult if flexibility is an issue. And this usually results in the legs touching the bar at the knees or the upper shins. I mentioned earlier that within each variation there are different ways to regress or progress, and requiring increased mobility is often a key factor. This is important because one of the things I learned throughout my training is that greater strength isn't the only requirement, and if I wanted to keep progressing, flexibility training is a must. Another essential feature of progressions within calisthenics is the transitional technique. And what it allows the practitioner to do, in most cases, not all, is mitigate the difficulty of a unilateral exercise by using an asymmetrical exercise to work toward it. So for example, the uneven push-up is a transitional technique that allows the practitioner to work toward the one-arm variation. In the case of hanging knee or leg raises, it's slightly different in that you're using asymmetry to work toward a more difficult bilateral or symmetrical technique. For example, this concept can be applied to hanging knee raises, which turns the variation into a bicycle-like movement where one knee is being raised at a time. Similarly, straight leg raises or pike lifts can be done by raising one leg at a time, making the variation asymmetrical and mitigating some of the difficulty. As I've mentioned many times before, when working with asymmetrical techniques, it's crucial that both sides be given the same attention. For my own training, I didn't apply asymmetrical techniques to leg raises simply because I didn't realize they existed in that context. I knew that they could be applied in other areas of training, but I just didn't put two and two together for some reason. And this is why I'm mentioning them here. In retrospect, these variations would have helped me break down my training early on, so I encourage you to take advantage. Another concept I've spoken about in previous podcasts, but I want to reiterate here because it's a great way to work with transitional techniques, is structuring training with 3 variations that represent your strongest, strong, and weakest. Your weakest variation would be a technique that you're just beginning to pursue and want to work up to using the other 2 techniques. Strong would be a variation that you are proficient at, however, is still challenging. And strongest would be a variation that you are proficient at and has become less of a challenge. For example, if your techniques include lying leg raises, the strongest, hanging knee raises, strong, and hanging straight leg raises, weakest, a good approach would be dedicating a session strictly to hanging straight leg raises, with more rest between sets and keeping repetitions low, which will allow for more focus on developing strength and technique. Then, on the next core session, starting with lying leg raises and then putting some serious work into hanging knee raises to further develop the foundation for your weakest variation. And as your hanging straight leg raise develops, you can then shift it down to the strong position and pursue a further technique. This certainly doesn't mean you have to avoid all other variations. I've just found it to be a very effective way to pinpoint my training and maximize progression through the chain. I want to end this episode off by touching on some tips for success when it comes to hanging core work. First, I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, but I want to stress its importance. And it's maintaining a tight grip on the bar, retracting the scapula, aka the shoulder blades, and don't let the shoulders sag. If it helps, establish a ritual before each set that ensures you're properly staged. Second, notice and maintain synergy between the muscle groups throughout the movement. And this can be done by keeping tension throughout the body. This will ensure that you maximize contraction, and it will also help recruit the required muscle groups to their fullest potential. Third, progression can be difficult, so give each level the time it deserves. There are many different muscle groups at work, so be sure to keep that in mind when planning sessions and allow for enough rest. Similar to midsection holds, as my training went on, I began to dedicate sessions strictly to hanging leg raise variations, or at least the majority of a session, to give them the attention they deserved without trying to do too much. It's also important to note that because different muscle groups are in play, development in other areas like pull-ups, midsection holds, grip work, and bridges will complement your hanging core work. Finally, I've said it before and I will say it again, focus on technique and pay attention to how you're performing the movements. Always strive for control and regress if necessary. You can find a good example of a hanging core progression that you can apply these concepts to in the transcript of this episode on the website www.elevateyourcraft.net. But my goal for this episode was to discuss concepts that can be applied to any hanging leg raise variation, even if it isn't necessarily in the progression listed. I'll also be releasing a video that will give you a demonstration of a progression chain. That way you'll have a visual guide. If you like the podcast, be sure to follow it on Twitter at EYCKAS. The Facebook, YouTube, and iTunes handle is Elevateyourcraft, all one word, and the website, again, is www.elevateyourcraft.net. Thanks very much, guys, and that's all for me today.